Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel on Finding Your Path to Your Best Emotional and Physical Health. Please, if you like what you hear today, click subscribe so you can get notified of new videos when they come out, which is several times a week, almost every day. Also, don't forget to download my 5 free videos that will give you some of the tips on laying the foundation to finding your best emotional and physical health. And if you feel that you need some extra help, please let me know and connect with me on the website. We can set you up for some sessions for coaching and get you moving in the right direction. Also, share this with anybody you think you might need it. I want this information to get out and be shared with as many people as possible and help as many people as we possibly can. So with that, let's get into today's topic. I want to talk about, this is part of the attachment series and how we've been talking about that. And I want to talk a little bit about what complex PTSD looks like. And that's another concept that is related to what we are talking about, because complex PTSD is much, much more common than we probably even know about, because it's not like an official diagnosis, and it presents a little differently. So complex PTSD is a little bit different than the PTSD we see maybe from a single event or from combat or a single assault or something like that. The complex PTSD is really much more about how we relate to others, because it starts at a much, much younger age. And this is kind of the term that we use when we're describing trauma in childhood, which is what we've been talking about with attachment and stuff like that. So trauma in childhood, and not just abuse, but neglect and emotional issues, can end up being complex PTSD, and I'll talk about what that looks like in a minute. But when people have difficulties and they're growing up, they have these developmental challenges, and they've been working to try to get this kind of diagnosis in what we call our DSM-5, which is our Bible. When we were talking about mental health professionals, it's our Bible for diagnosis, but they didn't want to diagnose it right now, probably because it is so complex and there's a lot of different symptoms that it can have, and it shows up a lot of different ways, and it doesn't have the typical, like I said, typical symptoms of someone that has had more simple PTSD. Now, that doesn't mean they can't have both, because complex PTSD, I think, can set you up for PTSD badly. So if you have complex PTSD and difficulties in relationships, and then you get into a situation or go into the military and then end up with additional PTSD, it can end up with a really, really severe case just because you already had a fragile foundation. So we kind of have to consider that. And then unfortunately, the military, it does tend to attract people that have some attachment issues sometimes, and they're seeking some kind of joining or some kind of organization to help kind of support them. So when they start, when they're kind of already broken, so to speak, or have a fragile foundation, then they are much, much more likely to be damaged by some of the things that they have faced in the military. And that's true also from other types of traumas, such as, maybe an assault or a rape or something like that. A lot of times people that already have a fragile foundation of their relationship with others tend to get into situations that kind of open them up for things like that, and they don't always set those adequate boundaries, and then they kind of don't recognize danger when it appears, and then they get hurt, and that's unfortunate, and certainly not their fault, since they were set up for that from a very young age. So we talk about complex PTSD versus an attachment disorder, and are they one and the same? Maybe, maybe not. A lot of the times the actual complex PTSD almost definitely has an attachment component. There's really no way to escape that, because usually the trauma comes from the parents or the caregivers, whoever those may be. So it's really a set of learned responses to other people, because that's what we're doing when we're young, is we're learning how to respond to other people, and it becomes a failure in their development and their social development. So they tend to just kind of develop these inappropriate ways of being. A lot of times it comes from abuse and neglect. It also is going to come from just the nurture side of things, not necessarily the nature, because it's not inborn and it's not characterological. It usually will consist of emotional flashbacks. And what's different about an emotional flashback is in the beginning, they don't really necessarily know what's happening because it does not have a visual component. In a traditional flashback, someone that has been in kind of a really traumatic situation, they will feel like they're reliving the moment. They will have the visual component. They'll have, a lot of times have smell and sound and feel like they're really there. Whereas a emotional flashback puts your body in that situation emotionally without maybe the visual part. So sometimes that's disconnected and people don't realize what's happening, but they feel the same. They feel the same inside as they did when they were a small child, and they don't always recognize that right away. They also have a tendency to self-abandon and have a harsh inner critic because that's kind of what they developed as a kid. And also they have a tendency to have a lot of social anxiety, or in some situations will have social anxiety. Toxic shame is something we'll talk about as well. That's also a part of complex PTSD, which is kind of developed around that kind of thing. So these emotional flashbacks, let's talk about that in a little more depth for just a minute. They actually have that feeling of abuse and abandonment, and it can be triggered a lot of times by a current relationship, and that's why relationships can be good if one of the people is fairly healthy, to help work through some of those things and heal from their complex PTSD. But they can also be repeating the same situation because that's what's familiar to them. It's usually associated with a lack of needs being met, and it will trigger that fight, flight, or freeze, and sometimes the fawn response, and we'll talk about those in additional videos. And it ends up with that extreme fear, which presents as anxiety and panicky. It's sometimes even suicidal is the only way to escape. And then sometimes it can move to despair, which is numbness, paralysis, and desperation, which can also lead to suicidality. So we have to kind of understand those underlying components. So that feeling of powerlessness that people kind of get stuck in can end up producing that kind of toxic shame and poor self-esteem that especially comes out in certain situations. And it doesn't mean that it's all over in all aspects of a person's life. You can have toxic shame in one area, such as in your relationships, and not in others, such as maybe in work or your physical exercise or something like that, because sometimes you'll get people that overachieve in a certain area to make up for that toxic shame in other areas. And that's kind of what they do as a compensatory strategy, and we'll kind of talk about that. When you go and get diagnoses, a lot of the times these things are misdiagnosed. And anytime I see someone that has anxiety and depression together, I'm thinking childhood trauma. And I'm trying to figure out what are their messages that they have been given as a kid that they're kind of stuck in, because that's typically what's causing that kind of reaction. And there's a lot of similarities with a bunch of different diagnoses. And as we go over the different attachment issues and development of these different types of complex PTSD, I'll talk a little bit more about what those other diagnoses look like. So complex PTSD will usually kind of develop into 4 different responses to others. And those are fight, which is kind of presents a little bit with the narcissist. Flight, which is more of an OCD, which is an overcompensatory strategy, and we'll talk about that. That's obsessive compulsive, obsessing over things, and we'll talk about that in more detail. Freeze, which is often seen with dissociation and a total shutdown of the person. And then fawn, which is the codependent, the kind of helping others and giving up everything of yourself to help the others. And so those kind of trauma responses play out in all parts and all aspects of our lives. So as we kind of get into more detail about what complex PTSD looks like and how to heal it, then we'll kind of go over those more in depth. So with that, I want you all to have a great day, and please connect with me on the website if you need a little bit of extra help or some guidance on how to heal from some of these things. So thanks everybody, and have a great day.